March 31, 1814. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had crowned himself emperor and conquered most of Europe, stood in his palace at Fontainebleau and told his most trusted marshal he would fight on. Marshal Michel Ney, the man Napoleon himself called the bravest of the brave, looked him in the eye and said no. Not a mutiny, not a coup, just 5 words that ended an empire. The army will obey its generals. This is the story of how the men Napoleon made, the marshals he promoted from nothing, the soldiers who followed him into Russia and back out again, became the men who ended him twice. Not through betrayal in the shadows, but through a slow accumulation of exhaustion, broken promises, and battlefield reality that even loyalty couldn't survive. This video delivers the verdict on exactly when and exactly why Napoleon's own marshals stopped believing the emperor could win. By 1813, Napoleon's marshals were not the men who had marched into Austerlitz 8 years earlier. Many had been fighting continuously for 2 decades. Marshal Berthier, Napoleon's chief of staff and closest confidant for nearly 20 years, was exhausted beyond function. Contemporaries described him as a man who had simply run out of will. Marshal Murat, Napoleon's own brother-in-law and one of history's most celebrated cavalry commanders, had already begun secretly negotiating with the Austrians to save his own throne in Naples. The men closest to Napoleon were no longer thinking about the empire. They were thinking about survival. The disaster in Russia in 1812 had done something no battlefield defeat alone could do. It had shown the marshals, for the first time, that Napoleon could be wrong. Not tactically wrong on a single afternoon, catastrophically, strategically wrong, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of men. Verdict: an empire built on the emperor's infallibility cannot survive the moment his generals stop believing in it. By March 1814, Allied armies were closing in on Paris, and Napoleon's forces were spent. Meeting with his marshals at Fontainebleau, Napoleon proposed one final march on the capital. He was met with silence. Then Marshal Ney stepped forward as spokesman for the others. Ney told him plainly that continued resistance was hopeless, and that abdication was the only path left that served France, rather than one man's pride. Napoleon, according to contemporary accounts, responded with fury, "The army will obey me." It was a claim built on 20 years of unbroken personal command. Ney's reply dismantled it in one sentence. "No, sire, the army will obey its generals." Within days, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. The emperor, who had never lost his army's loyalty on a battlefield, lost it at a table in Fontainebleau. And the verdict: Napoleon did not fall to Russia, or to Britain, or to Austria. He fell to the exhaustion of the men standing closest to him. 11 months later, Napoleon escaped Elba and landed in France with barely 1,000 men. Ney, still nominally loyal to the restored Bourbon monarchy, promised King Louis XVIII he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage. Instead, when the 2 men met at Auxerre, Ney rejoined him within hours. Proof that whatever the marshal's exhaustion, Napoleon's personal hold over the men who had served him had not fully broken. But something had changed. Ney arrived late to the 1815 campaign. At Waterloo, he led a series of increasingly reckless cavalry charges against Wellington's line. Historians still debate whether that was desperate brilliance or the actions of a man who no longer trusted his own judgment. What's not debated is the fact that Ney had betrayed two masters, and he fought like someone who knew it. The verdict: this was a marshal who returned out of loyalty, but fought like a man with nothing left to lose. This was not the same commander who won at Borodino. Waterloo ended it. Napoleon abdicated a second time, this time for good, exiled to St. Helena, where he would die 6 years later. But the marshal's story did not end with his exile. It ended with a firing squad. Michel Ney, the man who had told Napoleon the army would obey its generals, was arrested, tried for treason by the restored monarchy, and sentenced to death. He refused a blindfold and gave the final order himself. "Soldiers, when I give the command to fire, fire straight at my heart. Wait for the order. It will be my last to you. I protest against my condemnation. I have fought 100 battles for France, and not one against her. Soldiers, fire." He was executed on December 7, 1815, in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. Killed by the country he'd spent 30 years defending, for the crime of choosing Napoleon one time too many. This is the verdict this channel delivers. The marshals who turned on Napoleon in 1814 were not traitors. They were the last realists in a room full of men still fighting for a dream that had already ended. And Ney, who spoke the words that broke the emperor's authority, paid for his loyalty to both sides with his life. No general before or since has lived that particular tragedy so completely. Napoleon built an empire on the total loyalty of men he had personally raised from nothing. And it was that same loyalty, worn down by 20 years of war, that finally told him the truth he refused to hear. Fontainebleau was not a mutiny. It was an intervention. Ney's 5 words ended an empire faster than any Allied army had managed in over a decade of war. When Napoleon returned in 1815, the marshals who came back to him did not come back as believers. They came back as men who had already watched loyalty cost them everything once and chose to risk it again anyway. This channel's verdict stands. Napoleon's greatest defeat was never a battlefield. It was the moment his own generals stopped believing the emperor could still win.